and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Zach Bitter is an American ultramarathon runner and endurance coach. He is the current world record holder for multiple events, including the prestigious events of the 100-mile run for time and the 12-hour record for distance. And he claimed both on the same day, on August 24th, 2019, in his home state of Wisconsin. He is a former teacher and prides himself on being able to coach endurance athletes of any level and ability. He has appeared on several high-profile podcasts, including the Brett Kreischer Brettcast and the Joe Rogan Experience twice. That's impressive. He is the host of his own podcast, Human Performance Outliers, which he started with Dr. Shawn Baker in 2019. Please go check out that show. It's such a well-done podcast. It's one of the podcasts that I've followed for a very long time, and I really encourage the listener to go check it out. It's very good. There on that podcast, he shares his tactics of endurance training on a low-carbohydrate diet and hosts tons of amazing and fascinating guests. Zach Bitter, welcome to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks so much for having me on, Casey, and that was a very kind introduction.
Very much abbreviated introduction. It's always hard when I'm doing these to try to filter out some of the most important things when you guys are accomplishing so many things all the time. It's really challenging. So I followed your work for a long time, and I remember the day that you completed the race, which I want to talk about a little bit more in detail later on. But I remember seeing this picture, and the picture is of you on the track, and your arms are raised. And I'm like, what is this clown doing? He's clearly not at the end of running 12 hours. He must have just started. He looks great. Why is he celebrating just starting the event? He doesn't even know how good he's going to do. But sure enough, you looked just as good at the end as you did the beginning.
Yeah, that one played out very nicely in terms of just kind of how it felt. As you can imagine, I think with these longer endurance races, 100 miles, I think myself included, for a huge part of my career, just assumed that last 20, 30 miles was just a guaranteed misery where you're gonna have your least exciting, most painful moments in that kind of back part of the race. But something about 2019, I guess I figured some things out, and I ended up finding a way to have a couple 100-milers where I actually felt stronger in the end. And that's kind of more or less shaped, I guess, kind of the way I've been racing recently and the way I'm looking at racing going into the future.
That's amazing. You had a recent podcast episode with your wife, and you guys were talking about what was going on recently and how the pandemic year kind of changed everything. And I'm going to paraphrase this. I just want the listener to contemplate this for a second. You guys were talking about how you really wanted to work on speed this year, so you were really going to focus on marathon distances. If I want to work on speed, I might do a sprint for 50 yards, but that's going to be it. That's insane.
Yeah, it's all relative, I suppose. I think in endurance speak, or certainly ultramarathon speak, speed ends up being kind of up to your aerobic capacity. But yeah, it is funny because one of the interesting things I think about, getting into ultra marathons in general is a lot of folks, they'll get kind of interested in this, this desire, I guess, to run further than they've ever ran before. And the sport itself is just so wide ranging and has so much offerings, essentially limitless in how far you can end up going. So you get a lot of times people taking this pathway of, well, I did 50K, now I'll try 80K, now I'll try 100K, now I'll try 100 miles. And then they're kind of looking for what's next. And sometimes that comes at the expense of leg turnover, speed workouts, and things like that. So as the sport has grown and we've learned a little more about some of that stuff, it turns out that a lot of the typical endurance workouts are still very important to do, even if you're training for something long and slow. It just depends a little bit more as to where you're going to place them in your training protocol versus, say, doing a 5-kilometer endurance race where you might be doing some of those shorter intervals kind of closer to the race as you're perfecting kind of your race day intensity. Kind of same rule of logic with 100 miles. It's you want to be fine tuning the things that you're going to be using on race day as you get closer to it. But that doesn't mean you can't get benefits from doing things like short intervals of even as short as 30 seconds. Or I like to say my short intervals are usually between 30 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on kind of how I'm structuring the workout.
Interesting. Yeah, we've talked to a few of you ultra marathoners, and I think it's really inspiring. It's not something I think I will ever do myself, but it's really fun to talk to you guys. Where did your passion for running start?
Yeah, I think that the first time I was even aware of it as a sport was through the presidential physical fitness challenges that we did in middle school. I had
Wow.
a PE teacher who had us do that. I think it was sixth grade was the first time we did it. And it was that the mile run just stuck out to me as the one that not only was I better at relative to my classmates comparatively when we would do other things like the shuttle run and the V-sit reach and the pull-ups and that stuff where I
Oh man.
get absolutely smoked.
Wow.
And then the mile run, it's like my classmates, which amounted to a total of 8, including myself. So it wasn't like I was beating a ton of competition or anything like that. But the thing that kind of stuck out to me is it seemed like my classmates did that 1 mile and was more in line with, I don't really want to ever do that again. And I was kind of caught myself thinking, why do I want to do that again? And no one else does. So I think that was maybe the first and the sign in my own mind that it was something I could take seriously or that was even an option. And I was really fortunate that my parents were just super open-minded about extracurricular activities. The kind of rule in the house was more or less, you should probably be doing something, but what you're doing is more or less up to you. So I got the chance to do all sorts of things like football, basketball, baseball, softball, soccer, and then eventually track and field and cross country as well. So I got to experience kind of a wide range of different types of activities and kind of really figure out what I wanted to do and what I was good at and what I was maybe not good at.
Yeah, right. Wow. And you ran in college in Wisconsin, is that right?
Yeah, I went to a Division III school, University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So that's where I probably learned the most about running, at least in kind of the earlier stages. I would consider like my kind of middle school, high school running as just a little bit more ignorant in terms of just like I showed up and did what the coach said for the most part on the workouts, but didn't really take the time to try to understand why we were doing what we were doing. By the time I got to college, it became more of an interest as to, why do we run, say, 15 miles on Sundays, or why do we do these 400-meter repeats, and why do we do a tempo run? And like trying to understand kind of the ins and outs of it versus just doing it because we're told to. And I think that's when I really started to kind of decide that running was going to be something that I kept in my life. At that time, I assumed as a hobby going forward. So that was kind of an interesting experience for me as well.
Interesting. Did you have a pretty typical endurance athlete diet back then?
Yeah, I got in when I started taking endurance seriously. I started looking like, well, what do runners eat? And especially back then, when you looked at that, you were going to get kind of your standard kind of high carbohydrate, moderate carbohydrate at the lowest, and obviously a lot of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, that sort of stuff. So basically, post high school, when I started taking running a little more seriously holistically, I started looking into that too, and very much kind of followed that standard protocol for endurance athletes through college, and then a few years after as well.
What was the reason that you found a low carb diet eventually?
Yeah, it was kind of I just was fortunate that I had a couple things happen in parallel. And one was I started listening to podcasts while I was running. I think when I first started kind of training for ultra marathons, I was teaching full time. So I'd find myself basically working, running, eating, and sleeping for the most part. And at one point, when I was just doing it essentially for free and enjoyment, I thought there's got to be a way I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, or, not only run for this 2-3 hour time period every day. And that's when I kind of discovered podcasts. I thought, well, if I'm going to be out here for this long, I may as well learn something while I'm doing it. And eventually I started kind of tuning into some endurance podcasts, and some would talk about like nutrition and things like that. And that's kind of when I was made aware of like Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney and some of their research and work. And around that same time, I had done what I would consider my first full season of ultra marathons. I ran, I think it was 350 milers in about a 9-week time frame in the fall of 2011. And at the end of that, when I just did a kind of an assessment, I'll do this at the end of any season or any race at this point, where I'll just kind of look back and reflect on things and just try to really tease out what's working and what's not working. And when I was being honest with myself, there seemed to be some things that weren't very sustainable with my lifestyle. The big elephant in the room, so to speak, was the big training volume and the racing and things like that. But it wasn't like my running was struggling mightily and I was still enjoying it. It was more just like the rest of the day outside of the trainings tended to take a big hit from the training. So I noticed things like I stopped being a good sleeper in high school and college. I was always able to kind of go to bed and sleep 8-9 hours and, pop out of bed and not really give it much thought outside of that. And then by that point in my training, though, I found that I was, blocking off sometimes 10 hours a night just to try to get 8 hours of sleep because I'd wake up multiple times. And I also just noticed I had pretty big energy swings throughout the course of the day. I'd feel like I either had like all sorts of energy, I could do anything, or I could just sit down and take a nap. So those things just seemed like that if I kind of kept going that route, they weren't going to play out well for me from a long-term sustainability in the sport standpoint, potentially health as well. So I started exploring some options in terms of like what I could possibly do. And at the same time, I had kind of been hearing some of the stuff about the low carb stuff and thought I'd give it a shot. And when I did that, I had a pretty easy transition, I guess, relative to what you hear. I mean, some people have some horror stories when they're kind of switching over, but for me, it was pretty eventless for the most part. I went pretty strict keto for about the first month. And I noticed pretty quickly, like within the first week, I started sleeping through the night again, which was a pretty big sign to kind of, okay, I need to explore this more and kind of try to figure out what's going on here. And the other thing I noticed was rather than kind of having this ebb and flow of energy during the day, I had more of an even keel, steady energy stream. And the one thing that stood out in the negative, I guess, in that first month was, fortunately for me, I knew just enough at the time probably to make sure I did this switch when I was in an off season. So I didn't really have any structured workouts I had to do. I was just out like running when I felt like it and running as slow as I needed to feel good and just enjoy what I was doing. Yeah. So the one thing I did notice during that phase though, is that the first like 4 weeks, it seemed like almost like every other run would be a scenario of I'd be feeling like I was running, say, a 7-minute mile pace, but then I'd look down on the watch and it'd be like an 8.5-minute mile pace. So I was getting less return for my investment, so to speak, in the running world. And that was concerning up until like, about 4 weeks where, again, I knew just enough to kind of stick to it a little bit longer than bailing out after the first week or two because of that. And since I had the affordability of being in the off season, I didn't have anything to rush into. So I let it kind of ride out. And by about a month in, that started to normalize where my paces at those really low end endurance type intensity started to renormalize. So that was good. That was a positive sign in my mind. And then it just became a question of, well, what happens when I introduce structured training and start introducing things like we talked about earlier, short intervals, tempo runs, long runs, and actually have a periodized buildup? How would that impact a different nutrition strategy that I hadn't tried before? So that probably took me a good 1.5, 2 years to probably really fine tune. And what I ended up finding worked well for me was a low carbohydrate approach, but not necessarily strict ketogenic year round. There would be kind of phases during the year that made sense to bring my carbs kind of to ketogenic low levels where, they'd be 50 grams or less, but they were typically off season or what I call like a deload week where I reduce volume and intensity and just kind of focus more on recovery. And then when I would get into kind of peak phases of training, I would just be a little more liberal with carbohydrates. They would stay still within kind of the framework of what most would probably consider low carbohydrate, but not necessarily like ketogenic low. So there'd be phases where, I might be doing 20 hours worth of training, both with running and strength work, mobility stuff. And, for those type of weeks, I might flex my carbs up to 20% of my intake just to kind of assist the fast forward I was pressing on my metabolism training that much. So that seemed to really work well for me. I didn't find that kind of reverting back to a moderate carbohydrate yielded a whole lot better results in my workouts. So I kind of teased out, I guess, what you'd call maybe a sweet spot for me, or what one of the guys I really like to follow these days is Dr. Mike Nelson, because he's always kind of like, I don't want to say sitting on the fence, but he to a degree he is, where like I feel like if someone is pulling a little too far one way, he's like, well, let's pull you back a little bit this way, and you're just kind of finding that sweet spot for you so that you can really feel comfortable being able to run for long periods of time at a low intensity on water and electrolytes if you need to, but also, not have it just, come right back up if you do take in a carbohydrate source during a race or a hard workout and things like that. So it's kind of finding that balance for you, or that perfect medium. And the way I kind of like to describe it is I want to try to get fat adapted enough so that I don't have to try to, mainline fuel the entire time during a 12-hour event. But I can still take in some and kind of reap the benefits from that faster acting fuel source that most of my intra race fuel is going to be coming from. And, but not have so much of it that I feel like my stomach's going to be the downturn for my results.
Man, that is that is so well explained. And man, I can totally like empathize with endurance athletes when their performance is decreasing because they're switching to a low carbohydrate diet, and you're seeing those times slip downward, and people bail on the diet because you don't want to go slower. And I wish more people would just ride it out like you did a little bit longer, or like you said, periodizing. I don't think a lot of people realize how important that periodization is with exercise and nutrition. Like there are times when you can have more carbohydrates and be just fine. You can maintain leanness, you can have more energy, your performance can increase. And there's other times when, you don't need it. You don't need all those carbohydrates. I think that's so well explained. And I think the point that you just made about, the gut bomb carbohydrates that so many endurance athletes have, that I had for years. And even just the logistics of carrying around all those products all day it's so crazy. It's so nice to become fat adapted and access the fuel the way you did. I love that you made that point. What kinds of things do you fuel yourself with now when you're out on the road?
Yeah, when I'm training, it's usually it really just depends on kind of what's coming up next to a degree. So, and what I'm trying to kind of maybe more or less tease out in my training. If I'm doing, say, a long run and I want to get a gauge as to like what is kind of like, I like to call it like a fat adaptation field test where, if I can go for a long run with water and electrolytes and feel pretty even keel at kind of goal race intensity, then I'm fat adapted enough. And then I can start playing around with some carbohydrates to kind of see how I can move the needle a little bit on the performance end. And then I might have something that has like a little more carbohydrate in it. And there's a product that I really like called S Fuels Race Plus for that purpose. And their stuff that particular product is carbohydrate based, but they also blend in a little bit of fat and protein, which I think is useful from a digestive standpoint. So you're not just getting kind of like a pure sugars like in introduction, because with these long full day or single day type events, a lot of times you don't, even though the energy source you're going to probably dip into the harshest is going to be your glycogen stores. From a perspective of one, you could potentially deplete anyhow. It's almost like some of the sports fuels are too good at what they do, where they kind of process so fast. Your body, if you overshoot what you can tolerate, doesn't necessarily, know what to do with them. And then you end up with GI issues and things like that. So I think this is one thing I've moved into a little bit more in the last few years that I wasn't as aware of earlier, is just kind of having small amounts of fats and proteins with the carbohydrates. And most folks are going to probably do that through a food source or a whole food. They're going to kind of mix like a liquid performance product with some more kind of solid food options to help kind of do that. For me also, there's other scenarios where I want to have fuel during a run, but I don't want to introduce too much carbohydrate or any carbohydrate. So then I'll use this product by us called Train, which is it's a powder that you can mix, but it's fats and proteins basically. So with that product, I can keep myself from digging myself in too much of an energy deficit, but not necessarily, prod along a carbohydrate source for a workout where I'm not trying to do that. So sometimes I'll find that useful in kind of bigger training blocks where, if I'm out for a big run in the morning and I'm going to finish late morning, early afternoon, I don't necessarily want to have to make up that calorie deficit in half a day. And then if I have like another long effort the next morning, which isn't uncommon during the peaking phases of ultra marathons where you'll do back-to-back long sessions like that, a product like that can be very useful just to kind of stay on top of your energy needs during some of those longer sessions and not find yourself kind of flat the next day because you underconsumed too much the day before. So that's kind of how I structure it. On races, I'm definitely I like to say you have a plan A and a plan B from a fueling standpoint, and then plan C just in case. Usually I use aid station tables for plan C, just take a look at what they're going to have and just know what's there in case plan A and plan B are not working
Smart.
for you, or you just need a little variety in there. But I really like kind of blending two polarizing like textures or flavors. So like if my primary fuel on race day is going to be the S Fuels Race Plus, that's liquid. It's kind of a sweeter type of flavoring. I might counter that with something that's crunchy, salty, a little more savory, something solid, as a way to, not necessarily like have the same thing over and over again, which it sounds funny, but like if you just do that all day, you get like this kind of like palate fatigue type of sensation where you're like, after 8-9 hours, like, this again?
Yeah, for sure.
And you don't want to introduce any negativity when you're getting that far into a race. So keeping it positive is helpful. And if that means switching what you're eating just to get a little excitement injected into the day, then I think it's probably worth it.
Yeah, that's great. That's so well explained. That palate fatigue is real among your races. Let's back up. Tell me when do you remember the first time that you heard about carnivore diet?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the interesting things that I guess I was maybe had a unique experience with this, being a co-host for a podcast for a while with Dr. Shawn Baker, was when we first kind of started kind of planning to do a podcast together. It was the thought process was, okay, Shawn is like quite literally about twice as big as me, and he's also doing exactly the opposite I am from a training standpoint. He's doing incredibly short, incredibly intense workouts where he might go super hard for like 45 minutes, 60 minutes in a day, and then be done until the next day. Whereas I'm out there, mostly doing low intensity, high volume type stuff. But at the time we had a similar dietary pattern. So he was low carb keto. I was low carb, sometimes keto. And I thought, this is kind of a cool just perspective, I guess. He's got a completely different workout style, similar, at least macronutrient profile in his dietary habits as me. Let's do a podcast and kind of just talk about those polar ends of the spectrum, so to speak. And that's kind of how we came up with the name with Human Performance Outliers, because you're like, on one end, I'm going very long, very slow. On the other end, he's going very short, very fast, kind of two ends of that spectrum. And then we just started, recording shows and stuff. And right around when we started, I think is when he first kind of started playing around with a carnivore diet. So that became kind of a focus for a lot of our guests, is to try to understand, like, who are the people doing this? Why are they doing it? What's the reasoning? Is there anything we should be looking at with this? And just trying to tease out perhaps like where the successes were coming for folks with there, as well as what are some possible like negatives that could maybe come from something like that. So that's where my first like real introduction to it was. I guess I had like earlier, when I was less aware of just the spectrum of low carb, I had heard of like a small group of folks, I think in the Bay Area, that had been doing like a carnivore diet thing, but I didn't really give it any thought. I actually probably at that time was like, well, that's crazy. I wonder why they're doing that. and then, so, I consider myself a curious person. And I think like from a dietary standpoint, I'm just really interested in just the different versions of low carb and kind of what maybe their strengths and weaknesses are. And then, what works for me versus someone else. I'm just really interested in that. And I like to hear people's stories and their experiences with it. And, whether that proves anything right or wrong is, I guess, up to the listener. But I find it just an interesting topic personally.
I've heard you talk about this in the past as well, but what were some of the surprising things that you noticed with your own performance and recovery when you started switching over, not necessarily to a, quote unquote carnivore diet, but just adding more animal products in your diet? What were some of the things that maybe you weren't expecting that you noticed?
Yeah, I think, because I've done a pretty wide range at this point within kind of the macronutrient type of ratios that I was talking a bit about earlier. Anything from like mostly plant-based. I've never done a strict vegan keto diet to like basically almost, I guess maybe the way you could look at it is I got very close at points to playing around with a strict vegan ketogenic approach. And then I've also gotten very close to doing strict carnivore for a bit, just to kind of see what it was like. So most of 2019 actually is when I was playing around with some of the higher levels of or ratios of animal to plant products. And I think like a few things stuck out. I know digestion, I think, was always the biggest like advantage to that approach. I just always felt like I was ready to go. Like I never felt full or bloated or anything like that. I always felt like I was just content. So that was kind of interesting to me. The other thing that I'm interested in is just that I probably didn't necessarily know at the time, but have been pointed in this direction a few times since is uh, when you're focusing primarily on animal products, you're just going to by default get a lot more protein. So the biggest difference to me between say like plant-based and animal-based is animal-based, it's almost hard not to get enough or even sometimes too much protein. I mean, too much is kind of a nebulous term, but like more than you would actually technically need. Whereas with the plant-based approach, I found like, or even like when it's closer to a 50-50 split, I'd find myself like not necessarily like accidentally getting enough protein. And for those interested, I consider enough a gram per pound is usually what I'm targeting. I think that's where the protein research is trending these days is, the getting a gram per pound, especially for someone who's either elderly or very active like myself, that's probably a good spot to target. So it was maybe like a little more easy to implement because essentially, I mean, you limit your options down to a fairly small grouping of foods, and you can get pretty creative even with a strict carnivore diet, but it is a little less thought because there is a lot less options on it. So I found like it was maybe a little more kind of rinse and repeat. Didn't have to think about it too much. Didn't have to worry about getting enough protein because that was going to basically happen by default. So perhaps that helped with recovery because I was getting more protein, and it's hard to know for sure because there's just so many like variables that are either unaccounted for or uncontrollable when you're, training and been racing as long as I have. So it can end up being just as confusing probably as informative. But I didn't notice any big negatives or anything like that. I never went more than I think 2 weeks where I was technically strict carnivore, but I went basically the entire 2019 probably being at like 80% plus with that. And since then I've been a little more just like probably like a closer to a 50-50 split between plant and animal products. I'll play around with different things, different times just to kind of see how my body reacts. I think one thing that's interesting about the carnivore diet is it seems to be like a pretty good like reset in the sense that if you do that for say 4 weeks or a month or even get close to it, you're probably going to find yourself in a position where you can reintroduce foods and get a good idea of how your body does with them if you haven't had them in a while, and tease out which ones your body really jives with and which ones you maybe have to like really get used to or prepare properly in order for you to feel good on and find what works for you personally and kind of do what I like to do which is individualize your nutrition. I've always thought, I mean, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination with this stuff, but what I guess I probably bring to the table is, years and years, or at this point, decade to 2 decades of just training and sussing out like how a workout went, teasing out the data from the files that we have available to us now with all the technology and just trying to understand like what my body performs best at. And you do get very good at recognizing like the difference between just nailing a workout versus feeling just a pinch subpar. So for me, I think I have a pretty good idea for myself anyway, like, what's going to work and what's not going to work when I'm able to kind of play around with it and control at least the majority of the variables, or enough that I can sense a difference when I change something fairly drastically, or change one thing fairly drastically is maybe the way I should put that.
Yeah, no, that's also very well explained. You do such a good job of being mindful of your diet and tracking the data and making sure that what, you're eating and fueling your body with is supporting your training program. You mentioned a lot of these changes in 2019, which is when you set the record. How long had that record been on your mind? When did that become something that you wanted to try to accomplish?
Yeah, I think in 2013, I had, kind of a unique experience. I'd run a 50-mile race, just kind of like on the back end of curiosity, more or less. I had done what was going to be my peak race for that year. And it was fairly early in the year to have peaked in terms of when I would normally do that. So I didn't feel like I didn't feel too beat up relative to most kind of end of the season type A races. So I kind of just decided to jump in another 50 miler 13 days later, and ran a pretty solid time. I think I ran like 5:12 for 50 miles. And that was, I think, the fastest 50-mile time of the year in North America. And that got me an invite to this race here in Phoenix called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational. So kind of just rolling on the momentum of that 50 miler, I thought, well, let's try this 100 miler on a flat 400 meter high school track and just see what happens. So that's when I was first even made aware that there was these short loop timed events. And I ended up breaking the American record for 100 miles that day, running 11 hours and 47 minutes.
Wow.
And finding out at 90 miles into that event that there was also this record of 12 hours, how far you could run in that. I didn't even know it was an event at the time. That's how ignorant I was back then. But it's funny, the race director actually came up to me around, I think it was around 89 and a half, 90 miles, somewhere in there, and said, just so you know, when you hit 100 miles, you're going to likely do that in less than 12 hours. And you should probably just keep going because there's a mark for 12 hours, how far you can go. And he's like, and you happen to be on world record pace for that. So I'm like, oh, sweet. Like there was like a whole, like, it was like a shot of adrenaline. At that point, I was like kind of like residing to the pace I'd been going and was pretty confident I couldn't go a second per lap faster. And, after being told that, I ended up speeding up, I think like 3 or 4 seconds per mile or per lap for like the remainder of the race. So it just kind of goes to show you just like the mental side of the sport and what, like, some positive reinforcement can kind of do for your morale, I guess. And, that just got me really excited about this like kind of controlled environment where you could expect a certain amount of similarity from one year to the next. And that got me really curious because what's unique about these controlled environments is you can get probably a much better look at improvements or regressions or stagnation from year to year versus, some of these like more trail-based events where you might have a year where it's 30 degrees warmer or, they had to reroute the trail or something like that. And then it's a little harder to tease out, whether you did better or worse in that. So that kind of drew my attention. And at the end of 2013, after that experience, I kind of thought to myself, like, this is an event I want to kind of focus some time and energy on over my ultra running career. And that kind of set me on that trajectory, I guess.
Well, you mentioned controlled environments in 2019 when you decided to do that event. You decided to do it at not an Olympic oval, but a speed skating oval. I'm fortunate, to be just outside of Salt Lake in the suburbs, and I live, 15 minutes away from the Olympic oval that was used in the 2002 games, where the speed skating team is based out of. And I've speed skated there. I've gone over and interviewed Derek Parra there a few times for the podcast, and it's really cool. I mean, literally cool. Like it's a really nice temperature. There's a running track that goes around the ice, and I don't think a lot of people realize, like, the running track is actually a little bit wider, which means you're not taking as many tight turns. Is that right? Like you would on a 400 meter track?
Yeah, the one I did at the Pettit Center, it's just like the Milwaukee's version of the one in Salt Lake, essentially. I think it's like, if I remember correctly, like 438 meters or something like that. It was weird. Usually indoor tracks, their limitation is having a big enough facility to actually build a big track. So right. Most of these indoor facilities are like 200 meters. But this place, it was like, since they had to build, I think they have 3 hockey rinks and then a speed skating rink around those hockey rinks. So the tightest they could make that loop was 430 some odd meters. So that was kind of the loop distance for that particular one. But most of them, they're on 400 meter tracks. They're typically outdoors. So this one was like maybe a little bit more controlled even than that, since they keep the temperature at a steady 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside these training facilities to maintain the temps required to keep the ice frozen, I suppose. And then obviously you don't have light changes, you don't have direct sunlight, you don't have wind or anything like that could potentially, throw a wrench into the variables you're trying to control. So that was kind of a really unique controlled environment. And I think that's part of the reason why I was able to kind of run a little bit faster there. And, also things just lined up for me that day. I had a pretty good day overall in terms of just how I felt throughout the course of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you specifically that, like, how was the day? How was the prep? How was the day itself? How did everything line up so well for you?
Yeah, it was interesting because originally that year, my peak race was going to be the Spartathlon, which is this 153-mile race over in Greece. And what ended up happening was I had finished the San Diego 100 in June. So I had been kind of positioning my year to be kind of more trail-based the first half of the year. And then I was going to switch back to kind of road, track, flatter type running for the second half of the year. And, one of the reasons I did that is because one thing I noticed over the years of kind of targeting this flat 100-mile stuff was you kind of lose a little bit of the desire to kind of keep just doing the same thing over and over again. And I thought like maybe stepping away from it and focusing on something a little different would just be a good kind of boost in kind of mental energy and excitement for it. So after taking about a half a year away from the flatter, faster stuff, and then getting back to it mid-year, I just really, really recognized that helped a ton. Like I felt like way more invigorated to kind of go after some fast running splits. And just around that same time, Steve Durbin, who was the race director at the Tunnel Hill 100-mile that I had done in 2018, had reached out and said, "Hey, we're doing this timed event at the Pettit Center. If it might be a good spot for you to target a fast time if you're interested." So I looked at my schedule and it was a little tight in terms of like having an ideal buildup for it. But I didn't necessarily want to miss that opportunity to race in an environment that was as controlled as the Pettit Center. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. And I thought to myself, I'll train for it, but I'll keep in the back of the mind that if things aren't feeling great on the day of, I can always kind of, scale back, take it a little easier, bounce back quick, and use it as kind of a tune-up race for Spartathlon. So I actually almost did that at around 40 miles. So I started feeling like, I started slipping a little bit outside the splits I was trying to hit. One thing I do with these timed events is since it is so controlled, I try to target kind of a range between maybe 3 or 4 seconds of just like as fast as I think is sustainable and as slow as I can go and still hit like a meaningful target that I'm trying to get for the day. So I kind of started falling outside of that on the slow end and just kind of thought to myself, maybe I don't have it today. Maybe I should just kind of settle in here and just, take a decent result, but not like, anything that would be kind of top of my race result resume. But before I kind of made that decision, I thought, well, let's just get back on track for a few laps here and see how it feels. And I don't want to give up prematurely. And once I did that, I started hitting my splits again and started getting some momentum, and kind of in parallel to that, decision to kind of stay on track for a little bit longer, I was also running some kind of quick math in my head and projecting where I would get to 50 miles, where I would get to 100K. And as I kind of hit those spots, I found myself getting there a little bit quicker than I had estimated back at 40 miles. So that kind of continued the momentum. And ultimately, once I got to about 70 miles, give or take, I got to a point where I was able to wrap my head around it a lot better than in the past, I think, because I used a lot of my long runs. I did probably, I think it was maybe 6. I'd have to look back for certain, but I think it was maybe 6 or 7 like runs that were between like 27 and 33 miles going into that race that I was just trying to use as race day simulation, more or less. And one thing I did during those differently was those entire runs, I just envisioned where I would be on a 100-mile day if I had that left to finish. So if I had a 27-miler, it was, I'm 73 miles into a 100-mile. Let's work through the mental paces of what that's like to run that last 27 miles. Or if it was a 33-miler, it's like 67 to the finish. So when I got to that point on race day, I just kind of did a self-assessment of kind of how I felt physically, how I felt mentally. And it was just like really clear in my mind. I can easily do another long run here. So then it became less about running 100 miles or running for 12 hours and more about just doing one more long run. And that made it like just a lot more easy to process, I think, in my head. And, as I just kind of chipped away at that remaining roughly third of the race, it just kind of kept spinning in the right direction. And every time I felt like I was kind of hitting my top pace, I would find a reason to speed up a little bit. And I ended up actually running some of my fastest miles in the last 10. So wow. Things just lined up well for me that day. Fueling went great. My crew was just on point, getting me everything I needed when I needed it. And, things lined up. So
wow.
I was able to break the world record for both 100 miles and 12 hours that day, and kind of finish a project that I started a little over 5.5 years earlier. Was kind of where I had that target to try to break the world record for 100 miles.
That's amazing. That is so cool. I love that. So I have to just say, like, there's zero risk of this happening, but if that's me and I win the first event, the 100 miles, I'm not going for the second event. Like, give me the podium. I want my medal. Give me a cooler. Like, I'm stopping there. I just think it's so cool to know that you already knew that you won the first one and you were able to keep pushing and keep going. That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I've done that before. I did a race in 2015 where I was, it was actually one of my better buildups for a 100-miler. I was like super confident going in. I thought I had a really good look at the world record that day. And I was basically, I was on pace. I was actually ahead of world record pace through 80 miles. And then that last 20 miles was just like the biggest 20-mile grind I've ever been in. And
Wow.
So I watched that world record kind of slip away. I had a relatively good day still. I broke the American record for 100 miles and, basically averaged 7 flats for 100 miles. But the wheels were coming off so hard at the end of that one. I stopped at 11 hours and 40 minutes and didn't even try to run the last 20 minutes.
Nice. It's more my style.
Yeah. So it is funny how, like, I think so much of that is, both mental and just how you perceive your body is feeling, as well as pacing too. I mean, I paced myself much better at the Pettit Center than I did that day in 2015 at Desert Solstice. So one thing, I think you're always walking this razor thin line where you want to kind of get up to the pace that you think is going to be sustainable, or like slightly what you'd call a positive split, and then kind of tease that all day long. If you can get that right, that's probably when you're going to run your fastest time. And in 2015, I probably just overreached that a little bit at points earlier in the race, and it cost me on the back end. Whereas at the Pettit Center, I had a slightly more conservative first 50 miles and a slightly more conservative 100-kilometer split, which just allowed me to run kind of low to mid 6-minute paces during the final miles of that race, and actually negative split the second 50 miles.
Wow. That's crazy. I've always loved endurance sport, especially as a metaphor for life. And sometimes you do everything right, everything goes well, you win, and everything feels really great. And other times you do the same thing, you prepare, you do everything that you're supposed to do, and for whatever reason, you don't have the legs, or you get sick, or it just doesn't go your way. And I want to talk about another race that you completed not too long ago, the Desert Solstice, which you've already mentioned, this last year. Can you tell us a little bit about that event and how that was different for you?
Yeah. So the big difference there was that one I was going for 24 hours. So it was, these timed events. So historically I've done, a lot of 100-milers and then distance covered in 12 hours, not as many like real buildups and attempts at like just how far can I run in 24 hours. And so it was a lot of newness. I like put together a training plan that was different than anything I'd ever done before. So there was, I anticipated there maybe be some mistakes made, or there was certainly going to be some learning done. One thing I always look at with, especially if it's a new event or something new, is I'm not always afraid to try something different, or maybe something that's a little unproven if I think there's a chance it could work, or it will work for me anyway. Even if it means maybe not having a great race result, because a lot of times I'll learn more from a failed attempt or, a rough day than I will a successful day. Cause then you just probably take a little more time to try to dissect what went wrong if it didn't go great, or there's more incentive to anyhow. So I'd done like my biggest volume buildup for that race. And I think I maybe just overdid that a bit. And on race day, just had a lot of like kind of the opposite of the Pettit Center, where anything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And and I ended up having a pretty rough go of it. Like I ended up running, like about 116 miles in 24 hours.
Wow.
Which is kind of funny when you look at it, because like I ran 104.88 in 12 hours in 2019. I had a whole extra 12 hours and I barely eked out another 10 miles.
Wow. Wow.
So sometimes they don't happen the way you want them to. And I mean, I've run probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 ultra marathons at this point. So I think sometimes that's just, part of it. You take some risks. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. but you don't really know if you don't try in some cases. And one of the interesting things about ultra marathon, both on the nutrition side as well as the training side, the racing side, is we just know a lot less than what they know about, say, the marathon or any of these Olympic distance endurance events. And you can look at that in like maybe a discouraging way and say, well, how do I prepare for this if there's very little actual research or proven methods out there? Or you can look at it as kind of this opportunity to explore and be part of that learning process for the community as a whole. And I really like that. So, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of guys who are much more experienced and have seen a lot more of the 24-hour event stuff, the timed event stuff, competed at world championships and things like that. And took an opportunity to really kind of learn from them what they think is kind of a way to go about it and what's maybe not sustainable or not the best move for most people anyway. And I'm excited to kind of take some of that stuff and try to, put together a solid 24-hour at some point in my career. So that'll be something fun and exciting for me to explore further.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's just so well explained. I'm so glad you said what you said. Like when things don't go your way, that's your opportunity. That's where you learn. And I work with so many endurance athletes who are so laser focused on this event, and the event comes and it goes, and it's like the blink of an eye. It's just gone. Like you worked all that time for this one event, and we're so focused on the event, you missed where all the good stuff was. It's all the training. It's the hard days and pushing through, and you might have a great result on race day, you might not, but all the learning and growth comes from the training and the days you don't want to go out, but you do, and it's maybe raining or snowing, but you push through. Like I think that's where the true magic of endurance is. Just pushing yourself through on those days, and the result is going to be the result, whatever it is, but you kind of have to leave that and stay unattached to what the outcome is going to be, and get the magic from the training. This last year you did another event you set a 100-mile record for, and this one, the other one sounds crazy, but this one, it just sounds so miserable. Tell us about what you did.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think as most had this last year plus, it was just kind of maybe a little bit of a curveball in terms of like what was available, certainly from the racing side of things. So I had the opportunity to kind of train for and go race what would have been a flat fast loop 100-miler in London in April of 2020. And one of the reasons why I was interested in that particular event is it was built for 100-mile racing. So one of the biggest hurdles that is semi uncontrollable with the events I've done this in the past is a lot of them are 24-hour events, or in some case 6-day events, where there's a huge grouping of people out there who are trying to run either twice as long, or in the 6-day framework 12 times as long from a time standpoint as I was. And, with that, you're obviously going to be running slower. So the track protocol is always the person that is coming from behind or moving faster moves to the outside lane in order to pass. It just makes it easier because you don't want people to have to be looking behind them, getting out of the way, and you just end up having more confusion. So the protocol is stay as close to lane 1 as you can if there's no one that you have to pass. But if you're passing, move out to lane 2 or further if necessary in order to get around. So in a lot of these 100-mile or 12-hour events I've done in the past, I'm actually probably running, closer to 101 plus miles just from the time I've spent in lane 2 and sometimes lane 3. And this particular event was, since it was structured for fast 100-mile times, I thought there'd be a lot less of that extra kind of running involved. So it looked like a good opportunity. And I'd gotten most of the way through that training plan. I was kind of in the peaking phase where I was starting to put together some pretty lengthy back-to-back long runs. And once the end of March rolled around, basically everything got canceled. Every race for the foreseeable future was off the table. And I was kind of in a position where I was like, well, I'm really close to putting the final pieces of this training block on. Do I want to peel back and just kind of hit the reset button and wait for things to pop up? Or should I, try to do something that I can kind of contrive on my own? And I just pitched the idea to some of my sponsors and the folks at Nordic Track and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. And a lot more people were excited about it than I thought would be. And a lot of ideas that were far better than the ones I had originally were kind of proposed to me. So we ended up putting on like a full scale event, essentially, where I ran for 100 miles on a treadmill. And along the way, we brought in over 30 guest speakers, both hosts and kind of small guest spots of folks coming in, just sharing their stories, like their accomplishments in ultra running. And yeah, I did like a full day live stream essentially with that setup. So, the target for the day was to try to break Dave Proctor's 100-mile and 12-hour treadmill records, which he did at I believe it was at a trade show in was it 2018 maybe? It's either 2016 or 2018, but yeah, so that was kind of the target for the day. And fortunately for me, I had a lot to learn. I had never run over 30 miles on a treadmill, so there was going to be some uncertainty there. But I was able to stay a little bit ahead of Dave's pace for the day, and ended up taking a little bit of time off his world records for that. Wow. And it was really interesting though. I think like the psychological difference or the mental difference on the treadmill versus even like a short loop track was just different. And
for sure.
The way I kind of am thinking about it or have processed it is, I think it's something to do with like this maybe like almost subconscious sense of control, where if I'm out running on like a really, really tight loop, I'm still going to be able to make micro adjustments as I see fit, or just really kind of dial in what pace feels the most comfortable. And, I might run the exact same split one lap to the next, but there's going to be micro adjustments in there where I'm running slightly slower, slightly faster, like probably to the millisecond. And when you're on a treadmill, you can set the pace where you want it, and you can change the pace as often as you want to, but you're definitely still responding to the belt. Even if I change that pace every 30 seconds, I'm still spending 30 seconds going exactly the pace that treadmill tells me to. So it's almost like you're being told what to do versus deciding what you want to do. And that wore on me mentally. Like I found myself wanting to just step off and kind of reset my mind, and looking for reasons to hop off the treadmill if I could find them and that sort of stuff. So I spent a lot more non-moving time on the treadmill event than I typically would in some of these timed events. And that really stuck out to me, was that just that variance in kind of the mental side of things. So the other thing was just like, it's tough to build an event in your house. Like we had so much power running through the corner of the house. We had the treadmill set up. We had like air conditioner, fans, all the video equipment.
The fans cracked me up. Seeing those dinky little oscillating fans, like, oh man, that's got to be so stale in there.
Oh yeah. I underestimated how warm it got, just like in the small kind of like micro environment around the treadmill, because you got heat coming up from the treadmill motor.
Right.
Your own body heat isn't blowing away from you like it would be if you're running and you're actually moving forward. So it got warm, and it got warmer than I thought it would get. So I had to kind of reimagine my hydration strategy part way into it. We actually had the power was kind of like flickering in and out in the room. So like the screen on the treadmill would freeze. And we ended up having to run an extent. Thankfully, this ended up working. It was just like a shot in the dark, more or less. But I like somewhere around probably mile 30 or so, I think. I just asked my wife, Nicole, I was like, hey, if we can get like an extension cord, let's try running the treadmill cord all the way to the other side of the house and get on a different breaker and see if that'll kind of relieve some of the stress on this side of the power setup. And thankfully that worked. After that, everything ran smoothly. It was still warm in there, but at least the treadmill screens weren't going to freeze up on us. So, that's just a reality, I guess, of having something set up by yourself at your own house versus doing it at most folks doing these treadmill type things, at least the ones that I've been aware of. They'll do them in these big convention centers where you have like a huge room where you can get a little more circulation. You have a little more guarantee with the power setup, and probably more resources to test, kind of like stress test the setup more or less, versus at home COVID scenario type structuring with that type. So there's a lot of learning happening on the day before the day. It was kind of cool to play like part race director, part athlete, part entertainment all in one. It was a really unique experience, and I'm glad I was able to have it.
That's awesome.
It was definitely different.
A little warm. Oh man. Well, congratulations on that. You host one of my favorite podcasts. I've listened to it for a very long time. I try not to miss an episode, which is not easy because there are 240 of them. You have almost 500 reviews, most of them 5-star. What an amazing thing you guys have created. I know it's something that's always evolving. I want to ask you, what's something that maybe pops into your head that's something surprising that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I think there's two things that really stick out, or actually it depends on how you look at it, I guess. If you I'll say three things. So one is just the amount of information and things you learn by getting access to some of the guests. So like we've been really fortunate. Like I've had a lot of like PhDs, professors that have, given us time to come on the show. I mentioned protein research and some of the stuff that's been more recent. So we've had some of the top protein researchers in the world come on the show. I mean, Professor Stu Phillips out of McMaster,
He's
Professor
great.
Jose Antonio, Don Layman. A lot of these guys, I've been fortunate to talk to guys like Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, Dr. Mike Nelson, who I would consider folks who are really looking into like the role of low carbohydrate and also just, the role it can play in athletics and sports and things like that. And the variance between, different types of like endurance events or just events in general, like how, what can work one way doesn't necessarily work another, and really get a much deeper understanding of what's kind of going on and be able to ask questions that I'm curious about that have no idea how to answer on my own. So that's been great. The other two things are just the difference between hosting versus going on podcasts. I had, spent a few years using that medium as kind of one of my favorite things to do, is just to go on other podcasts and chat with other hosts and, talk about that sort of stuff in a little bit more a long form thing. So just kind of learning like what it's like to be on the other end of that was really interesting to me. And then just kind of learning the back end side of it where, you mentioned some of our 5-star reviews. I'm sure you can find a couple 1 or 2-star reviews for our early episode audio quality.
Not many. I mean,
there's a huge learning curve. Just figuring out, because when Shawn was still co-hosting with me, like we just decided let's record a few episodes, get them up there, and then we'll kind of learn on the fly.
That's great.
And it was fun. And but it didn't come without its hurdles. It's just figuring out like, well, how do we get that fuzzy background noise on your computer to stop, and then we get yours to do a stop, and then all of a sudden mine starts doing it, and then the guest starts doing it. So there is some learning to do there. And fortunately I've been able to, like, I guess maybe fine tune the equipment and figure out what I'm doing on the back end a little bit better, a little more efficiently, to kind of clean some of that stuff up over the time frame. But yeah, so that was another kind of just, it's a cool skill set to have too, is just to let's record this video and audio and let's chop it up and edit it and do all that stuff. It's kind of it was a fun skill set to learn that I wouldn't have ever thought that I was probably going to dive into at any point before that.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. That is fair. I was thinking like, well, wait, your sound quality is pretty good, but now that I'm thinking back, some of those early ones were a little rough.
Yeah.
You guys were real about it though. That's what was fun about it. It's like every podcast today has weird Zoom pings and static and all that stuff. But if the content is good, people continue listening. That's what I did. I mean, you guys have great guests. You're very real. I can tell that you're asking very genuine questions that you're curious about, like you said. And I mean, the product is just so good regardless of the quality. But yes, now that I'm thinking about your early ones, there was some rough ones.
the real ones stick around, Case. You're a real one.
That's hilarious. That's great. One of the other cool things about podcasting is capturing conversations with people that are close to you and hearing you interview your wife. For me, that's one of my favorites. I love listening to that. Tell me how special is that to hit record and talk to, your partner in life?
Yeah, I always love it when Nicole is able to take some time out and come on, or guest host. She's guest hosted a couple of them as well. And I think she'll probably do a little more of that going forward too. Because like for me personally, I've just learned so much about, work ethic is probably the big one for her. She's, she keeps, while I stepped away from my full-time job to focus on training and running, she stayed in her career trajectory and was very successful doing so. And, wow. But maintained her running and training and racing at a very high level. So watching her kind of navigate a stressful day or a week is always inspiring and reminds me that I cannot probably always do better. And, so getting a chance to kind of hear just how she kind of approaches these things and be able to see it. I have a front row seat to it essentially. So, it's powerful for me. And it's certainly like one of the reasons I think I was able to break the world record for 100 miles when I did, because I had spent just enough time with her at that point where I think I was able to kind of learn from her and kind of see what works and what doesn't work for someone else that's kind of trying to do the same things I am essentially from an athletic standpoint, but also kind of have what would be a more stressful kind of occupation than I have.
Wow. That's such a cool story. I love hearing that. This has been an awesome conversation. We have covered a lot of ground, pun totally intended. I want to know what's one simple thing you would like to leave the listener that's could be something that they could plug into their life and see a benefit.
Yeah, I think specific to like exercise or sport, I think, keep an open mind. I think it's one thing I always find interesting is like as adults, we kind of get away from just like finding something that involves physical movement or physical progress that you enjoy and just do something because you think you should to stay in shape. Whereas like kids, they just run around and play. It's like they want to play football, they play football. If they want to, play tag, they play tag, and like the list is endless. But as adults, we tend to kind of whittle it down to, well, maybe I'll train for a 5K, or maybe I'll get a gym membership. And then it doesn't really get much further than that in a lot of cases. So I think like, keeping an open mind and finding an activity that you'd want to do, even if it didn't yield any health or fitness benefits, that's going to be the thing that kind of keeps you coming back, keeps you motivated, keeps it sustainable long-term. So if that's ultra marathons, awesome. Come find me.
That's great.
If not, find that activity and, like really get into it. So I think that would be my message is like, don't be afraid to explore different ways of fitness or exercise that are fun and exciting to you.
I love that. I've always said that like if mountain biking or, ice hockey or, some of my passions were like actively bad for my health, like I wouldn't care because I love those activities. So I think that's a really great piece of advice. You said if somebody's into ultra marathoning, they should come find you. They're not going to find you if you're on course because they will be very much behind you. Where can people go to find you, to connect with you and maybe, work with you or listen to some of your content?
Yeah, I think the one spot that kind of connects to everything is my website, which is just zachbitter.com. In terms of things I'm probably most active on is on social media, probably Instagram, which is @ZachBitter. And then the podcast, I'm usually putting up 1 or 2 episodes per week, just Human Performance Outliers Podcast. You can find that on all audio platforms as well as YouTube.
That's great. Zach Bitter, this has been an amazing conversation. World record holder, host of an amazing podcast, and still just such a kind and humble dude that has really great advice. We're so grateful for you and for your work. We're grateful that you took some time out of your very busy day to come talk to us today at Boundless Body Radio. So thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do. And I would just really highly encourage the listener to connect with you online. Your website's great, dude, by the way. It's really good. It's well done.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been kind of playing around with some stuff on there. It's been kind of a fun spot to link everything to. So I just recently put up some training plans for folks. So even if you're just getting into it, I got some stuff for you if you're interested in just kind of building some base, and folks check those out and want to try one out, go for it. If there's things on there that you'd like me to add, reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to do it.
That's great. Well, thank you again so much. We're so grateful for you and for your time today.
Awesome, Casey. Thanks again for having me on.
Absolutely. It's been an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.